Senegal just did what no stable African democracy has dared to do in decades. It cut France off completely. No extraditions, no cooperation, no compliance. And within hours, a military bloc with 5,000 troops called it a blueprint for the continent. This isn't a diplomatic spat. It's a calculated fracture of a system that's held for 60 years. France hasn't responded yet, but the silence isn't calm. It's a kind of quiet that comes right before everything changes. Because if Senegal can do this without consequences, every former colony is now asking the same question: why can't we? Senegal just suspended all extradition agreements with France, and within hours, the alliance of Sahel states publicly endorsed the decision. That endorsement matters more than it might seem, because AES isn't just a symbolic coalition. It's a military and political bloc led by Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré, backed by 5,000 troops, and built on a single organizing principle. African states no longer need permission from Paris to govern themselves. And now Senegal, historically one of France's most reliable partners on the continent, is being held up as a model. Not for revolution, not for rupture, but for something quieter and potentially more destabilizing: reciprocity. The suspension itself is a legal move. Senegal halted extraditions to France after years of unreciprocated requests for its own nationals accused of crimes abroad. But the diplomatic implications are what make this consequential. France has spent decades assuming compliance from its former colonies, particularly in West Africa. That assumption has rarely been tested by a country as stable, democratic, and diplomatically significant as Senegal. When Mali or Burkina Faso expelled French forces, Paris could frame it as the actions of military juntas or unstable regimes. Senegal doesn't fit that narrative. It's a functioning democracy with strong institutions and a president elected on a platform of sovereignty and reform. That makes the suspension harder to dismiss and much harder to punish without risking further alienation across the region. AES's response reveals how quickly legal disputes can become geopolitical leverage. Traoré's government didn't just support Senegal's decision. It framed the suspension as evidence of a broader regional awakening, one that AES represents, and that other West African nations should join. This isn't rhetorical flourish. AES has been actively building an alternative security and economic architecture independent of French influence. It has its own defense pact. It's discussing a shared currency. And it's courting partnerships with Russia, Turkey, and Gulf states to reduce dependence on traditional Western allies. Senegal's consideration of joining AES, even informally, signals that this is no longer a fringe movement confined to the Sahel. It's becoming a viable regional bloc with real diplomatic and military capacity. For France, this creates a compounding problem. Losing influence in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was damaging, but those countries were already in crisis. Senegal is different. It's stable. It's economically significant. And it has historically acted as a bridge between France and the rest of West Africa. If that bridge begins to fracture, Paris loses more than a bilateral relationship. It loses credibility across the region. Because if Senegal can assert judicial sovereignty without severe consequences, other countries will ask why they can't do the same. And that question, once asked widely enough, unravels the entire post-colonial framework of assumed French primacy in West African affairs. The broader implications extend beyond France and Senegal. ECOWAS, the regional bloc that has traditionally aligned with Western interests, is already fractured. AES members formally withdrew earlier this year, citing what they called foreign interference and lack of regional solidarity. Senegal has remained in ECOWAS, but its openness to AES alignment suggests it sees value in hedging. That hedging reflects a deeper shift. African governments are increasingly viewing sovereignty not as a binary choice between Europe and everyone else, but as a spectrum of partnerships that can be recalibrated based on respect, reciprocity, and national interest. Senegal's suspension of extraditions is a test case for that recalibration. What happens next will determine whether this moment is remembered as a one-off legal dispute or the beginning of a structural realignment. If France responds with punitive measures, economic pressure, or diplomatic retaliation, it risks confirming the very narrative AES has been building. That cooperation with Paris is conditional on African subordination. If France attempts to negotiate or address Senegal's grievances, it may stabilize the relationship, but at the cost of acknowledging that the old rules no longer apply. Either way, the terms of engagement have shifted. And the question now isn't whether African nations will continue asserting sovereignty. It's whether Europe is willing to accept that assertion as legitimate, or whether it will resist until the relationships themselves become unsalvageable. The answer will shape the next decade of African geopolitics. The Republic of Senegal has just done something nearly unthinkable in the post-colonial era. It suspended all extradition requests to France. Not delayed them, not negotiated terms, suspended them entirely. And the reason cuts deeper than a single legal dispute. For years, Dakar has submitted formal requests to Paris for the return of Senegalese nationals accused of serious crimes on French soil. Some of those requests involve high-profile cases that matter to victims, to families, to the credibility of Senegal's justice system. And for years, those requests have been met with silence, bureaucratic delay, or outright refusal. Meanwhile, when France submits an extradition request to Senegal, the expectation is immediate compliance. That imbalance, that double standard, has now been publicly rejected. This isn't just about reciprocity on paper. It's about what reciprocity means when one country holds vastly more leverage than the other. France and Senegal are not equals in this relationship, and they never have been. Senegal was a French colony. French is still the official language. French companies still dominate key sectors of the economy. French military bases still operate in the region. And French judicial expectations still carry the weight of imperial assumption. That assumption is what President Bassirou Diomaye Faye's administration is now challenging. By suspending extraditions, Senegal is asserting that its legal system deserves the same respect France demands for its own. It's a calculated recalibration of power, framed not as aggression, but as principle. The timing matters. Across the Sahel, African governments are pushing back against France in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have all expelled French forces and severed security partnerships. Chad recently ordered the departure of French troops after decades of cooperation. These are not isolated incidents. They reflect a broader shift in how African states view their relationships with former colonial powers. Senegal, historically one of France's closest allies on the continent, has now joined that conversation, not with military expulsion, but with legal sovereignty. And in some ways, that makes the move even more significant. Senegal isn't abandoning diplomacy. It's redefining the terms. What makes this suspension so potent is its legal clarity. Senegal is not accusing France of violating international law. It's pointing to a pattern of non-compliance within the existing framework. When one side consistently ignores requests while expecting full cooperation in return, the system stops being mutual. It becomes extractive. And for Senegal, continuing to participate in that system without pushback would be an admission that its sovereignty is negotiable, that its courts are subordinate, that its citizens abroad matter less than French nationals in Dakar. The suspension is a refusal to accept that hierarchy. France has not yet issued a formal response, but the silence itself is revealing. Paris cannot easily dismiss this as the actions of a rogue state or an unstable government. Senegal is a democracy. It has strong institutions. It is not at war with France. This is a legal dispute grounded in documented evidence of unequal treatment. That makes it harder for France to frame the suspension as unreasonable or politically motivated. But it also places pressure on Paris to either acknowledge the imbalance or risk further deterioration of a relationship it has long taken for granted. The broader implications extend beyond Senegal and France. If other African nations see Senegal successfully assert judicial sovereignty without facing severe retaliation, it sets a precedent. It signals that reciprocity is not just a diplomatic talking point, but an enforceable standard. It demonstrates that African governments can leverage their cooperation, not as a favor to former colonizers, but as a mutual exchange between equals. And it raises a question that will shape the next decade of African geopolitics. If respect must be demanded rather than assumed, how many more countries will follow Senegal's lead? The answer to that question will determine whether this moment is remembered as an isolated legal dispute or the beginning of a structural realignment in how Africa engages with Europe. Senegal suspended extraditions to France, and within days, Ibrahim Traoré publicly praised the decision as a model for African sovereignty. That praise wasn't symbolic. It was strategic, because the alliance of Sahel states isn't just talking about independence from Western influence. It's building the infrastructure to enforce it. 5,000 troops, independent command structures, security protocols designed to operate without French oversight or approval. And now, with Senegal considering alignment with AES, what began as a legal dispute over extradition reciprocity is becoming something far more consequential. The foundation of a coordinated African security bloc that doesn't answer to Paris, Washington, or Brussels. This is where the stakes become clear. AES was formed by military governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger after they severed ties with France and expelled its forces. For years, Western analysts dismissed the alliance as unstable, authoritarian, and unsustainable. But AES has survived. It's formalized mutual defense commitments. It's conducting joint military operations. And it's attracted interest from countries that don't fit the junta profile. Senegal is a democracy. It has a civilian government. And yet, it's openly exploring partnership with a bloc that Western powers view as adversarial. That signals something deeper than opportunism. It signals a recalculation of where security and sovereignty intersect in West Africa. Traoré's endorsement of Senegal's extradition suspension reframes the narrative. He's not just supporting a legal decision. He's presenting it as evidence that African nations can assert authority over their own systems without Western approval, and that those assertions can be defended collectively. By linking Senegal's judicial sovereignty to AES's military autonomy, Traoré is building a case for regional self-reliance that goes beyond rhetoric. He's offering an alternative framework, one where African states pool resources, coordinate defense, and reduce dependency on external actors who have historically used security partnerships to maintain influence. And for countries tired of that dynamic, the offer is increasingly appealing. The security implications are not hypothetical. AES has already demonstrated operational capacity. Its forces are deployed across the Sahel, managing insurgencies and border security without French or UN support. Those operations are imperfect, and there have been credible reports of civilian casualties and human rights concerns. But they exist, and they function independently of the structures that once defined West African security. If Senegal formalizes ties with AES, it adds legitimacy, resources, and strategic depth to the alliance. Senegal has a professional military. It has regional credibility, and it has coastline access that landlocked Sahel states lack. That's not just symbolic weight. It's logistical and strategic advantage. For France, this evolution presents a compounding challenge. Losing military footholds in the Sahel was damaging, but those losses could be framed as temporary setbacks in unstable regions. If Senegal, a stable democracy and longtime ally, begins coordinating security policy with AES, it confirms that the shift isn't about regime type or instability. It's about sovereignty, and it suggests that African governments across the political spectrum are reassessing whether partnerships with former colonial powers serve their interests or simply perpetuate dependency. That reassessment, if it spreads, undermines the entire architecture of French influence in West Africa. What happens next could redefine the region. If AES expands to include Senegal, it becomes a bloc with democratic legitimacy, economic diversity, and military reach. That makes it harder to isolate, harder to dismiss, and harder to counter without direct confrontation. It also creates pressure on other West African nations to choose sides. ECOWAS, already fractured by AES withdrawals, would face renewed questions about its relevance and its alignment with Western interests. And countries like Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria would need to decide whether to reinforce ties with Europe or hedge by engaging with a rising regional alternative. The broader question is whether Africa is moving toward a new security order, one built on continental cooperation rather than external partnerships. Senegal's consideration of AES alignment suggests that order is no longer theoretical. It's being constructed in real time through legal assertions, military coordination, and strategic realignments. And if that construction continues, the geopolitical map of West Africa will look fundamentally different in 5 years than it does today. The only uncertainty is whether that transformation happens gradually, through negotiation and adaptation, or abruptly, through confrontation and rupture. Senegal's suspension of extraditions to France has done something unexpected. It's become a symbol, not just of legal reciprocity or diplomatic assertiveness, but of a question that's spreading across West Africa and beyond. What if the rules we've been following were never meant to serve us? That question is now being asked in boardrooms, presidential offices, and military headquarters from Dakar to Abuja. And the fact that it's being asked at all represents a shift in how African governments understand power, sovereignty, and their place in a global order that has historically treated them as subordinate. This isn't abstract political theory. The suspension arrived at a moment when African states are already reconsidering their relationships with former colonial powers. France has lost military bases in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. The CFA franc, long criticized as a tool of French monetary control, is facing renewed calls for replacement. And regional blocs like the Alliance of Sahel states are building security and economic frameworks that function independently of Western approval. Senegal's decision fits into that pattern, but it also expands it. Because Senegal isn't a military government. It's not isolated or economically desperate. It's a stable democracy with strong institutions, and its choice to assert judicial sovereignty signals that the push for autonomy isn't limited to regimes in crisis. It's becoming a mainstream political position across the continent. Ibrahim Traoré's endorsement amplifies that signal. By praising Senegal's suspension as a model for African self-determination, Traoré is linking a legal dispute to a broader ideological project. He's framing reciprocity not as a technical legal principle, but as a political stance, one that rejects the idea that African nations owe deference to European powers simply because of historical ties or economic dependency. And he's offering AES as the institutional vehicle for that stance, a bloc where sovereignty isn't aspirational. It's enforced through mutual defense, coordinated policy, and collective refusal to accept double standards. For countries watching Senegal's move, that offer is increasingly compelling. The socio-political implications go deeper than diplomacy. For decades, African governments have operated within a framework where asserting independence from Western powers carried significant risk. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, loss of security partnerships. That framework created a kind of learned caution, where sovereignty was something to be negotiated rather than demanded. Senegal's suspension challenges that caution. It demonstrates that reciprocity can be asserted without catastrophic consequences, and that the worst-case scenarios often used to justify compliance may be overestimated. If other nations internalize that lesson, the psychological barrier to assertive sovereignty weakens. And once that barrier weakens, the entire post-colonial power structure becomes contestable. This is where the transformative potential becomes visible. Senegal isn't just defending its legal system. It's participating in the construction of a new political identity for West Africa, one built on the premise that regional cooperation and strategic independence can replace dependency on external actors. That premise isn't universally accepted yet, And there are real questions about whether AES and similar initiatives can sustain themselves economically and militarily without Western support. But the fact that the premise is being tested at all by stable democracies and not just military regimes indicates that the appetite for change is broader and deeper than many analysts assumed. What happens next will depend on how other African nations respond. If Senegal formalizes ties with AES, it legitimizes the alliance as more than a coalition of Sahel juntas. It becomes a viable alternative model for African governance and security. That puts pressure on ECOWAS, the African Union, and other regional institutions to either adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. It also forces Western powers to decide whether they're willing to engage with African sovereignty on equal terms, or whether they'll continue treating the continent as a sphere of influence to be managed rather than a collection of independent states to be respected. The broader question is whether this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a structural realignment in African geopolitics, or as a brief episode of assertiveness that eventually fades under economic and diplomatic pressure. The answer depends not just on Senegal, but on how many other nations follow its lead, and on whether the vision of sovereignty being articulated right now by leaders like Traoré and governments like Senegal's can be translated into durable institutions, sustainable partnerships, and a political order that doesn't require permission from Paris or Washington to exist.